Hey, 11th and 12th grade. Welcome back to literature class. We are reading Words by Jenny Wittrop, and I've asked you to please try to aim for 2 chapters per day, not including Wednesdays or weekends. So that's about 10 chapters a week. We may have to up that because I was looking at the chapter count. Some of the chapters are a little shorter than others, so we may have to up that to maybe 3 chapters a day. But right now we're sticking with 2 just for right at this moment. We should be up to chapter 10. It's a little shorter than 2 chapters a day, but I wanted you to kind of babying you into the story. So we're starting with chapter 3 today. We already met Sierra, who is an artist. We know that she lost a child when the child was still very, very young. We know that she has felt guilt for the loss of this child because she was responsible for her child's death. We know that she goes to the cemetery once a year on the day of her child's death, and puts flowers on the grave, and then spends the time really just kind of meditating. And she has never been able to forgive herself for the death of her child. And this is something that comes up frequently with her mom and with her friend that we're going to meet today, Ruby. They are constantly after her okay, it's been 12 years and you are continually beating yourself up over this. There was nothing you could do. You can't bring her back. You need to get to the point where you can forgive yourself and then move on. And she has a hard time with that because she feels so incredibly guilty for the death of her child. We also met Kaylee, and Kaylee is really just as much of a central character as Sierra is. I almost called her Sequoia. That's funny. But Kaylee, we see her first in the book. And we're going to see her first again today in chapter 3. Kaylee is a little girl who is about 11. She's going to be 12. She was abandoned by her mother and left in a logging cabin up in the Redwoods area of California, Northern California. Her mom abandoned her, but left her with the boyfriend. So mom's boyfriend is now living in this cabin, and Kaylee is living in the cabin at the same time. I don't want to say he's taking care of her because nothing that he is doing is taking care of Kaylee. Kaylee is being abused by this man, and part of that is emotional abuse. When Kaylee's mom died, he gathered all of Kaylee's mother's things and much of Kaylee's things and took them outside of the cabin and burned them in a big bonfire. The only thing that Kaylee was able to rescue from that fire the day after was this little music box that was in a stuffed animal her grandmother had given her before her grandmother had died. And it still plays music. It plays Jesus Loves Me. Kaylee knows the tune. She doesn't really know the song so much, but it's the one thing she was able to rescue. The other thing that she has left that belongs to her mom is something that the boyfriend never really noticed in this almost empty cabin. He never really noticed these things, and that's because they were made part of a bookshelf. Kaylee's mom had this habit of being with multiple men. She would just follow one man after another and move in with them. And then she would do this little nesting thing. She would settle in. And in the cabin, she took 2 boards and she found a couple of cinder blocks that she used to prop up a board and use that as a shelf. And then for the second shelf, she had some books that held up that second shelf. And he has not noticed those books because they have been part of the furniture, literally part of the furniture. Kaylee, on the other hand, uses those books as a way to escape from the trauma that she is currently in. While her mom was still at the cabin, the boyfriend started molesting Kaylee. And he told Kaylee, if you tell your mom, she will hate you and she will abandon you and you will never see her again. When Kaylee's mom disappeared, Kaylee assumes that her mom knows about the molestation and blames Kaylee for it. But she is terrified that if she leaves the cabin, if she tries to get help, if she walks away, that her mom might return. And if Kaylee's not there, she will miss the chance to see her mom. So Kaylee is really stuck in this really horrible position of putting up with horrific abuse that no child should ever have to go through, and feeling like she can't leave because she might miss her mom's return. So when her mom disappeared, Kaylee is feeling guilty. She wonders if her mom was angry with her. Maybe she knew about the molestation and blames Kaylee. She also makes mention several times in the chapters we're going to read today that her mom would get really frustrated and twitchy and get really angry sometimes. And sometimes it was when she was combing Kaylee's hair. And if the comb pulled at a knot and Kaylee squirmed or flinched, the mom would get really angry at her and, just start yelling at her. And Kaylee got to the point where she just wanted to be very quiet, because her mom was happiest when she was quiet, when Kaylee was quiet. And one of the things that happens to Kaylee as a result of her mom's abandoning her and the boyfriend's horrific sexual, mental, and psychological abuse of Kaylee is that Kaylee loses the ability to speak. The desire to be quiet to please mommy has really kind of morphed into this inability to say anything to anyone. Kaylee can't even talk out loud when she's alone. She has completely lost the ability to communicate verbally. So when we go into today's little wrap up of what you've read in chapter 3, Kaylee discusses this this feeling she has when she's going through the abuse. When she thinks about the abuse, she hears in her brain, in her mind, a scream, and she cannot stop it. She can't think her way out of it. It's almost like she has a little mental break, and she begins to scream, but she can't verbally scream, so it screams inside of her own brain. And sometimes to get herself to stop that mental scream, she will hurt herself. She will punch. She'll pinch herself, or she'll punch her leg or something to get that scream to stop. Sometimes she will even plug her ears, even though it's not a verbal scream that she wouldn't be able to hear on the outside. She plugs her ears, tries to run away from the scream, anything to get away from this horrific thought of this abuse. And it really is horrendous. Now, she, in chapter 3, it's right after a night where she has been abused, and she goes to the stream to bathe and to eat blackberries because there is no food in the cabin. So she starves for many days in a row sometimes, and she doesn't really have full access to this. Even though she's in a very tiny cabin, she doesn't always have full access to everything in the cabin, including like the shower. So she goes out of the cabin whenever he's gone, and she often just calls him the boyfriend or him. Whenever he's gone, when she knows he's not going to return to the cabin, she'll leave and go bathe in the stream and eat wild berries and whatnot. So she's doing that, and then she thinks that he's an alcoholic based on what she's read in the dictionary. And then when she's done bathing and trying not to think about what happened the night before, she goes someplace that she calls her sanctuary. A sanctuary, because she's learned this word in the dictionary. And there's lots of wonderful little moments here in this book where she lists a word, and then it's part of language, like sanctuary is a noun. So I love the way the author has done this to bring the idea of this little girl collecting words. It just makes it so perfect. So I'm going to read this one paragraph. It's great. It says, this tree, this burned out sequoia tree that is still alive, even though it has a burned out hollowness. This tree is my sanctuary, noun, a place of any place of refuge, asylum. That means it's my safe place away from him. So as she collects words, and that's the name of the book, she's learning these words from the dictionary and applying them to her life. She is a very knowledgeable, very wise girl. So she stays away as much as possible during the daytime because she knows that in the afternoon there's a possibility he could come back early, and she needs to be back in the cabin when he returns. If she's not there, he may hurt her because he's concerned that she will wander away and tell somebody what he's up to. So he has her convinced that she needs to be there. She does go to her sanctuary tree. She surrounds herself with pine cones, and there's a crack in one part of the trunk, and she can see out of it. And while she's looking out, a Jeep pulls up, and she can see a woman get out of the Jeep, sitting on top of the Jeep, crying, just looking out and just kind of enjoying the day, the sunshine of the day. This is the first time Kaylee sees Sierra, because the woman who is on the Jeep is, of course, Sierra. And then we go into the next chapter where Sierra talks about how she ends up in the clearing where that tree is. And that's the same day that she has gone to the graveyard to remember her daughter who's passed away. And while she's sitting on that Jeep and she's kind of looking around, she thinks she sees a little girl's face inside this tree trunk. And it shocks her because she's already thinking about the child that she was responsible for the child's death. And now she sees this child's face in the tree trunk, and she thinks she's seeing something. She thinks she's become mentally disturbed or deranged. And so she's like, maybe I didn't really see that. And that's going to be part of the whole thing that brings her back to see this tree again because of this little girl. And then we get the background, the full background of Sierra, which is just heartbreaking. Sierra was raised in a Bible-believing home and then left to go to college, had the opportunity to get a really great education, but instead of focusing on school and focusing on the life that her parents prepared her for, a godly life, instead Sierra got involved in drugs and sexual impropriety. And it's her best friend and roommate, Ruby, who sees that Sierra is actually falling very hard into this abyss of drugs and sex. And it's Ruby is the one who realizes first that Sierra's pregnant, even though she's a drug addict. She has no idea who the father could be. And it's Ruby who calls Sierra's parents and tells them what's going on. By this time, Sierra is a full-blown drug addict and pregnant. Her parents drop everything in their lives. They purchase a bungalow. It's the same bungalow, we find out, that Sierra is living in still in this book. They purchase this bungalow and they help Sierra get off drugs. They make sure she gets to a doctor for prenatal care. And the doctor tells Sierra flat out, there is a very low chance that this child you're carrying is going to survive. But Sierra has it in her mind that because she wants this baby, that it's going to be God's will that this baby lives. That's her thought process. She ends up going into labor very early. She ends up giving birth to a very premature little girl. The little girl is not capable of living outside the womb. So she only lives for about 9 days and then passes away. And at that point, Sierra decides that God's not really on her side. because he didn't give her what she wanted, that he doesn't really love her, that he's really angry at her for the way she's behaved and she's being punished for the death of her child. And it also hurts the relationship between her and Ruby. They never really get that closeness that they had when they were roommates. But now there is opportunity. Ruby is never given up on being a friend to Sierra. And so Sierra, meeting her for lunch on this day after seeing this little face in the tree, kind of spills to Ruby and tells her what she saw. And she says, but I think it was just a figment of my imagination. I don't know. And Ruby kind of digs and digs and digs. And finally she's like, well, if you don't know, why don't you go back and find out? Find out if she's real or find out if she's a figment of your imagination. But either way, you need to know. So that's what Sierra decides to do. She decides to go back. And I believe that takes us to the next chapter. I'm sorry, I'm flipping on my phone because that's where my book is. I use my Kindle app on my phone all the time. It's great. I love this app. Okay, so our next chapter is chapter 5, and it's about Kaylee. And it's still dark outside when she wakes up. She's hoping to go back and see this woman that she saw on the Jeep, and she's hoping that it'll be that next day. But when she wakes up and it's still dark out, she's really waiting for him to leave, with the boyfriend to leave. And then she can get dressed and go and sit in the tree and see if this woman reappears. And she calls that anticipation. She's just waiting. But it turns out that's not going to happen for her, because it turns out that the man, the mom's boyfriend, is remaining at the house that day. So that means she can't leave. He is not going to work. And then he also tells her, I brought some groceries. You can have an egg if you want to. And so she makes eggs for her and him, and she's getting ready to cook them. And that's when she remembers that there's no electricity. The power has been cut off. So he gets angry when he realizes that. He gets stressed and he leaves her alone in the house. She makes herself a mayonnaise sandwich. Ugh. Okay. And, but never leaves the cabin because she doesn't know when he's going to return. So she ends up losing the whole day that she had hoped she could spend looking for Sierra, watching for her. And she ends up having to stay in anyway. She's trapped alone in this cabin. But she does use the time to figure out how to introduce herself to Sierra. This is really the first time we see Kaylee wanting to make contact with somebody. She's been alone for so long and is so afraid. So she reads through a book by Emily Post, who was the ultimate expert on things like politeness and manners. So she reads through how to introduce oneself. You stand up, because this was written in the 1950s. You stand up, you bow, and you shake hands, and that's how you introduce oneself. But she doesn't really know how you can do anything other than that, because she can't speak. She can't verbalize and say who she is. All she can do is kind of mime. The next chapter is Sierra feeling kind of restless at the very beginning of the chapter, getting up, and we find out a little bit about her art. Her art is collage. She cuts up pieces or tears pieces of colored paper, and then she creates art out of the colors, and she creates layer after layer after layer, and that is really indicative of who she is. All these impenetrable layers that make up Sierra. So she has a nightmare at the very beginning of the chapter where she dreams that she goes back to the tree, and inside the tree is Annie's coffin. Annie was the daughter that passed away. And that wakes her up, and she gets up and she does a little bit of art, doing some of her collage. And then let's see. So the canvas died. Okay. Then she decides to go back to Bonnie Doon. Now, this is the same day that Kaylee has to stay at home. Okay, we got to remember that that's what happens. So when she gets there, Kaylee is not there, but this gives Sierra a chance to see the tree without Kaylee there, because this is Kaylee's refuge or sanctuary. It has some of her things in it. So again, Sierra, remembering the nightmare from that morning, walks into that tree, kind of expecting to see the casket and seeing it in her mind's eye, and then pushes through and then notices that there is a circle of pine cones, sits down in the circle of pine cones with her dog, her brand new dog, Van, who is lovely, and watching some squirrels, and then notices that there's a mayonnaise jar in there. And she opens the mayonnaise jar. It's clean, and it has a few little odds and ends in it. A smooth stone, a penny, a broken pencil, a few slips of paper, and what looks like a gold chain. And she unscrews the lid, empties the contents into her hands, and looks at some of the papers that are in this jar. And one of them, as soon as I read this the first time, I'm like, oh, I know what book that is. But on one scrap of paper, there is this printed. Their names were Aunt Sponge and Aunt Spiker. And I'm sorry to say that they were both really horrible people. They were selfish and lazy and cruel, and right from the beginning, they started beating poor James for almost no reason at all. Now, Sierra reads that, and she's like, oh my goodness, poor James. Who's James? Oh, poor baby James. It's from a book. It's from James and the Giant Peach. So she's looking at this